Introduction. Why is a crooked letter? Okay, so you have to hear about the story that kicks this whole book off. The author, Ethan Kross, starts with his grandmother, Dora, who was a Holocaust survivor. I mean, can you even imagine? She went through the absolute worst things imaginable but came out of it as this force of nature, tough, loving, and famous for her matzo ball soup. But here's the thing, she never talked about the war, except for one day a year at a memorial gathering where she would just break down. As a kid, Ethan was super curious and would ask her about it, but she'd always shut him down with this weird English idiom she'd picked up, why is a crooked letter? Her message was basically, don't dwell on the painful why, just live the life you have. This refusal to talk, yet her obvious resilience, basically lit a fire in him. It made him obsessed with understanding emotions, not just hers, but everyone's. How do we cope with the worst things? Why do some people thrive while others crumble? He realized we're all just kind of stumbling through, using whatever makeshift tools we can find to manage our feelings. He then contrasts this with the history of emotion management, which is wild. We're talking about people literally drilling holes in their skulls thousands of years ago, a procedure called trepanation, to let the bad feelings out. Even up to the 1940s, we had things like the lobotomy winning Nobel Prizes. We've been so desperate for relief that we've resorted to some truly brutal stuff. The point is, despite all our progress, we're still struggling. We have ministers of loneliness and a mental health crisis that's costing $1 trillion a year. So, this book is his answer. After writing his first book, Chatter, people kept asking him more and more about the broader world of emotions. He decided to write this book as a blueprint, a user manual for our emotional operating system. He introduces this amazing concept of shifters, tools we already have inside us and in the world around us, that can help us turn the volume up or down on our feelings. It's all about learning how to use these shifters to navigate our emotional lives, instead of just being managed by them. It's such a cool and empowering way to start the conversation. Chapter 1, Why We Feel. Alright, so get this, Chapter 1 starts with the story of a Navy SEAL named Matt Mosdam going through SERE training, which is basically torture school to prepare for being a prisoner of war. He's starving, stuck in a tiny concrete box, and totally sleep-deprived. You'd think the key to surviving something like that is to just turn off all your emotions, right? Be a robot. But that's the big twist, that's not what he does at all. While he's feeling frustration and fear, he's also totally crushing on another trainee, Laura, who is in a cell across from him. He's using those positive feelings, that little spark of connection and humor they share through sign language, to balance out the misery. He doesn't shut his emotions down, he uses them. And that's the core idea of this chapter. Emotions aren't a bug, they're a feature. They're not something to be eliminated, they're essential tools for survival. Kross points out that we are emotional creatures almost all the time. One study showed people feel an emotion over 90% of their waking hours. And it's not just one at a time, we often feel a mix of positive and negative feelings simultaneously. It's a beautiful mess. He then breaks down what an emotion actually is, a complex response to something meaningful, involving our body, like a racing heart, our thoughts, appraisals, and our outward behavior, like a facial expression. The most important takeaway here is that all emotions have a function, even the bad ones. That whole good vibes only culture can actually be toxic. Anxiety prepares you for a threat, sadness signals you need support, and even envy can motivate you to work harder. But, of course, they can also go haywire. That's where the famous Dunedin study comes in. It's this incredible long-term study from New Zealand that followed over 1,000 people from birth. It found that a child's ability to regulate their emotions was a more powerful predictor of their future health, wealth, and success than even their IQ or socioeconomic status. But here's the hopeful part, that ability isn't fixed. People can get better at it, and when they do, their lives improve. The chapter ends with this amazing metaphor of our emotional life being like a priceless Stradivarius violin. We're all born with this incredible instrument, but most of us were never taught how to play it. This book is the lesson. Chapter 2, Can you really control your emotions? So, after establishing that emotions are crucial, Chapter 2 dives into the million-dollar question, can we actually control them? It starts with this gut-wrenching story about a mom named Louisa on an airplane whose daughter, Ella, has a severe allergic reaction to peanuts. In the moment, she's a hero, calmly administering the EpiPen, handling the emergency. But in the weeks after, she's an emotional wreck, haunted by terrifying what-if thoughts and intrusive images of her daughter dying in all sorts of horrible ways. She feels completely helpless, like her fear is just too big to control. This is a feeling we all know, right? One study cross-mentions found that nearly 40% of people believe that emotions are fundamentally uncontrollable. And in one sense, they're right. Cross makes a brilliant distinction here. He says we can't control the initial trigger. The loud noise that makes you jump, the joke that makes you laugh, or the scary thought that pops into your head, that first part is automatic. Intrusive thoughts are super common. One study found 94% of people have them. You can't stop that first wave from hitting. But here's the game changer, you can control the trajectory. You can influence how long an emotion lasts and how intense it gets. He uses the metaphor of an itch from poison ivy. You can't control the initial itch, but you can control whether or not you scratch it. That ability to override an automatic response is called cognitive control, and it's basically our human superpower, housed in our highly developed prefrontal cortex. We evolved this incredible brain hardware to help us navigate complex social situations and plan for the future, instead of just reacting to everything. This brings him to the work of the legendary psychologist Albert Bandura and his concept of self-efficacy. Bandura did these wild experiments in the 60s where he cured people of debilitating snake phobias in just a few hours. He did it by gradually showing them they could handle their fear. What he discovered was that the belief that you are capable of handling something is a master key to actually being able to do it. Louisa, the mom from the beginning, eventually stumbled on this. She realized she could disrupt her cycle of scary thoughts by distracting herself, which gave her a sense of control and broke the spell. The chapter ends on this incredibly empowering note: you can't control the trigger, but you absolutely have a say in what happens next. You just have to believe it's possible first. 6527. Chapter 3, What a 1980s Power Ballad Taught Me About Emotion, Sensory Shifters. Okay, this chapter is so fun and practical. It's all about what Cross calls sensory shifters, which are basically the easiest emotion regulation tools we have. He starts with this super relatable story about driving his daughter, Danny, to her soccer game. She's in a terrible mood, nothing he says is working, and she's bringing everyone down. Then, Don't Stop Believin' by Journey comes on the radio. He starts belting it out, and pretty soon, Danny is smiling and singing along. By the time they get to the field, her mood is completely transformed. A cheesy power ballad did what no fatherly pep talk could. This kicks off his whole point: we constantly use our five senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, to shift our emotions, but we rarely do it intentionally. He realized that even though he's a scientist who studies this stuff, he wasn't consciously using these tools in his own life. It's like we know music can pump us up, but we wait for the right song to come on the radio by chance instead of creating a playlist. The science behind it is fascinating. Our sensory cortex is one of the oldest parts of our brain, hardwired to our emotional centers. This connection is ancient and lightning fast. That's why these shifters work so well. They tap into what he calls the law of least work. Our brains are lazy. We prefer easy solutions. And it doesn't get much easier than putting on a song, looking at a photo, or smelling a certain scent. It requires way less mental effort than trying to logically reframe a negative thought when you're stressed out. He talks about the Proust effect, like when the smell of baking cookies instantly transports you back to your grandmother's kitchen and makes you feel all warm and fuzzy. And the opposite, the Garcia effect, where a single bad experience with a food can make you feel sick just thinking about it later. Our senses are powerfully tied to memory and emotion. The takeaway is so simple and powerful: become an intentional user of your senses. He tells this great story about his grad student, Chas, who bakes bread when he's stressed. The feeling of the dough, the smell, the whole process, it's a sensory bundle that grounds him immediately. The chapter ends with a great exercise: figure out which of your senses packs the biggest punch with the lowest cost. For him, it's music. It's immediate, effective, and free. So, the challenge is to stop leaving our emotional state to chance and start curating our own sensory experiences. So cool, right? Chapter 4, The Myth of Universal Approach, Attention Shifters. This chapter tackles a huge piece of conventional wisdom that might actually be wrong. Cross calls it the myth of universal approach, this idea we're all taught that to deal with negative emotions, you have to face them head on, talk them out, and process them, and that avoiding them is always unhealthy. He brings back the story of his grandmother, who seemed to thrive by not constantly talking about her trauma, which always puzzled him. He asks the fundamental question: when you're dealing with something painful, where should you put your attention? Do you zoom in on it, approach, or turn your spotlight away, avoid? The mainstream view, based on a lot of solid research, is that chronic avoidance is bad and leads to more anxiety and depression over time. And that's true. But Cross argues that we've oversimplified it into a good versus bad binary. He introduces the amazing story of Dennis Rodman during the Bulls' NBA Finals run. Rodman would famously disappear to go party in Vegas or hang with Hulk Hogan right in the middle of the season. While it looked like he was just being a mess, his coach Phil Jackson understood that Rodman needed that rope, that distance and distraction, to be able to perform at an insanely high level on the court. It was strategic avoidance, and it worked for him. This leads to the core idea of flexibility. The real key to resilience isn't always approaching or always avoiding, but being able to switch between the two depending on the situation. This is backed up by the incredible research of George Bonanno, who studied New Yorkers after September 11th. He found that the people who coped the best were the ones who could both express their emotions and suppress them effectively when needed. They were good switchers. They had more than just a hammer in their toolbox. So how do you know when to switch? Cross gives some super clear warning signs. Approach isn't working if you're just getting stuck in a negative loop, what he calls chatter, and not making any progress. And avoidance isn't working if the problem keeps popping back up, or if you're relying on unhealthy distractions like substance abuse, or if you find yourself constantly seeking reassurance without actually tackling the root fear. It's such a liberating idea that sometimes, giving yourself a break and distracting yourself isn't a weakness, it's a strategic move that allows your psychological immune system to do its job. My grandmother and Dennis Rodman knew what they were doing all along. Chapter 5, Easier thing said than done, Perspective Shifters *. So what happens when you can't look away? When the problem is right there in your face and avoidance isn't an option? This chapter is all about that. And it opens with the most insane story about astronaut Jerry Linenger on the Mir space station. A fire breaks out, smoke is filling the tiny station, oxygen masks are failing. It's a life-or-death crisis where he absolutely has to confront the situation. In those moments, you need a different kind of tool, a perspective shifter. The classic tool here is reframing, which you might know from therapy. Cross explains it using the simple ABC formula: an adverse event happens, which triggers a belief about it, which leads to a consequence, your emotional reaction. The idea is, if you can change your belief, B, you can change your emotion, C. Simple, right? But as a friend of his perfectly put it, that can be easier F. *ing said than done. When we're stressed, our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain we need for reframing, basically gets hobbled. The more intense the emotion, the harder it is to think our way out of it. So what's the solution? You have to gain distance. Cross uses the metaphor of trying to rescue your panicking kid in a swimming pool. If you let them climb all over you, you'll both drown. You have to keep them at arm's length to help. We need to do the same with our emotions. He offers a few amazing, science-backed tools for this. The first is distanced self-talk. This is so cool. Instead of thinking I'm so stressed, you talk to yourself using you or even your own name, okay? You can handle this, Ethan. He uses the example of Novak Djokovic giving himself a pep talk in the mirror during a Wimbledon match, saying you can do it, not I can do it. This tiny linguistic shift tricks your brain into seeing your problem with the clarity and compassion you'd offer a friend. The second tool is mental time travel. Instead of being stuck in the now, you zoom out. You can fall back into the past and remember other hard times you've survived, which builds confidence. Or, even more powerfully, you can project yourself into the future. Ask yourself, how will I feel about this in a week? A year? 10 years? This reminds you of impermanence, that this too shall pass, and instantly reduces the intensity of the present moment. He shares a heart-wrenching story of a man, Vic Strecker, who lost his daughter and found his way back to purpose by gaining this kind of perspective. This chapter is really about how to find agency even in the most overwhelming moments by changing the lens through which you see them. Chapter 6, Hidden in Plain Sight, Space Shifters. Now we get to shift our focus from our internal world to the external one. This chapter is all about how our physical environment, the spaces we're in, profoundly shapes our emotions. The opening story is perfect. It's about Laurie Santos, the famous Yale professor who teaches the university's most popular class ever on happiness. The irony is, because of the class's success, she became incredibly famous, overworked, and deeply unhappy. She was burned out, felt like a hypocrite, and none of her internal tools were working. Her breaking point came when she felt irritated by a student asking for help. So what did she do? She left. She took a sabbatical and moved from her life in New Haven to a small sublet in Cambridge, a place that held positive memories for her. This change of scenery was the key. It wasn't just about getting away, it was about getting the physical and mental distance she needed to see her situation clearly. Away from the horse blinders of her Yale environment, she realized she could step down from her demanding role as head of college, a solution that had been invisible to her before. Cross argues that we have two main strategies when it comes to using space as an emotional shifter. The first is what Laurie did. Switch your space. This taps into the idea of place attachment. We all have these emotional oases, a favorite park, a childhood home, a specific coffee shop, that make us feel safe and content. Sometimes, just physically going to one of these places can hit the reset button, like it did for Sean, a soldier who was spiraling after his wife left him and found safety by flying home to his parents' house. But you don't always have to get on a plane. The second strategy is to modify your space. This is about curating your immediate environment. Cross tells this funny story about forcing his friends to take leftover pizza home after a party. Why? To remove the temptation from his fridge so he wouldn't have to fight it later. It's about making self-control easy by changing your surroundings first. You can also add things to your space. After doing research showing that looking at a photo of a loved one can help people recover from emotional pain, he went out and filled his office with pictures of his family. The chapter is a great reminder that we're not just passive inhabitants of our world, we can be architects of our spaces to support our emotional well-being. Chapter 7, Catching a Feeling, Relationship Shifters. This chapter is all about the people in our lives and how they are one of the most powerful external shifters we have. It kicks off with Cross describing a classroom exercise where he secretly assigns student leaders to act as either super supportive cheerleaders or dismissive assholes during a logic puzzle. The results are immediate and dramatic. The cheerleader-led groups are buzzing with energy and collaboration, while the asshole-led groups are silent and grim. This perfectly illustrates emotional contagion, the idea that we catch feelings from others like a virus. This happens largely unconsciously through mimicry. We copy people's facial expressions and body language, which in turn triggers the corresponding emotion in us. And it's not just in person, this happens at a massive scale on social media, powering entire movements. The chapter then zooms in on 3 specific, high-impact ways we can harness our relationships. First is how we talk to each other for support. He warns against the trap of co-rumination, where you and a friend just vent and amplify each other's negativity. The perfect support conversation involves a balance. You need someone who will first validate your feelings, that sounds so hard, but then help you zoom out and shift your perspective. The key takeaway here is to intentionally build your own emotional advisory board. A few trusted people you know can provide this balanced support. Second, he tackles social comparison. We're told it's the thief of joy, but Cross argues that's an oversimplification. We're hardwired to compare, it's how we figure out where we stand. The secret is how you use it. Comparing yourself to someone doing better, upward comparison, can either make you feel envious or inspire you to work harder. Comparing yourself to someone doing worse, downward comparison, can either fill you with gratitude or make you anxious that you'll end up like them. The power lies in consciously framing the comparison in a way that helps you. Finally, he talks about the simple but profound power of helping others. He cites a fantastic study where people were given cash and told to either spend it on themselves or on someone else. The result? People who spent the money on others reported a significantly bigger happiness boost. Doing kind acts is a reliable way to shift our own mood for the better. This chapter is a brilliant guide to being more intentional about the emotional currents that flow between us and the people in our lives. Chapter 8, The Master Switch, Culture Shifters. This chapter brings us to the biggest, most powerful shifter of all, culture. Cross calls it the master switch and the air we breathe because it influences all the other shifters, our senses, attention, perspective, spaces, and relationships. It's the outermost Russian nesting doll that contains everything else. The central story is about a woman named Hollis, who is 5 years sober and gets unexpectedly laid off from her job. She's spiraling into panic and shame, and the urge to drink is overwhelming. But instead of reacting, she responds. How? By tapping into the powerful culture of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. She calls her AA friends, they recite the Serenity Prayer, they remind her of AA sayings like "Where are your feet?" to ground her in the present. AA's culture, she says, saved her life. Cross then brilliantly breaks down how a culture like AA works its magic on our emotions. He argues that any effective culture is built on 3 core components. First, there are beliefs and values. These are the foundational ideas a group cares about. He contrasts the fight-back value of his Brooklyn childhood with the never-show-anger value of the Utku Inuit people, showing how these beliefs are shaped by the environment and needs of the group. Second, there are norms, which are the spoken and unspoken rules that enforce the values. We follow norms because we have a primal need to belong and avoid the pain of social exclusion. Third, there are practices, which are the specific behaviors and rituals that bring the beliefs and norms to life. For Hollis, the practice was the simple act of calling people from her list. Prayer, ceremonies, and even a pre-game ritual like LeBron James's chalk toss are all practices that provide a sense of control and reinforce cultural values. He points out that religion is a big kahuna of culture, using these same 3 ingredients to provide comfort and meaning to billions. But you don't have to be religious to benefit. You can lean on the positive cultures in your own life, your family, your friend group, your workplace, by identifying and embracing their values, norms, and practices. And, even more powerfully, if a culture isn't working for you, you now have a blueprint for changing it. You can challenge the beliefs, establish new norms, and create new practices. The story of psychologist Pippa Grange transforming the culture of England's national football team by focusing on trust and vulnerability is a perfect example of this in action. This chapter gives you the control panel to the most influential force in your emotional life. Chapter 9, From Knowing to Doing, Making Shifting Automatic. Alright, this is the final piece of the puzzle and it's so important. This chapter tackles the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it in the heat of the moment. We can read all the books and know all the strategies, but when we're emotionally flooded, our brains often just freeze. So how do we make using these emotional tools as automatic as buckling a seatbelt? The model for this is the Navy SEALs, bringing back the story of Matt Mosdam. Before a mission, SEALs don't just have a plan A. They meticulously plan for every imaginable contingency, drilling if-then scenarios into their heads over and over. If we take fire from this building, then you do this. This makes their responses swift, coordinated, and almost automatic, even when something completely unexpected happens, like the glass wall explosion in the story. This perfectly sets up the psychological tool at the heart of the chapter, WOOP. It's an acronym that stands for Wish, Outcome, Obstacle, Plan. It's a scientifically backed method developed by two psychologists, Gabrielle Ettingen and Peter Gallwitzer, who happen to be married. Here's how it works. First, the WOO part is what Ettingen calls mental contrasting. You start with your wish, e.g., I wish I could be more patient with my kids. Then, you vividly imagine the best outcome of achieving that wish: we'll have a better relationship and I'll feel like a good dad. This part gets you energized. But then comes the crucial step: you identify the main obstacle that stands in your way. When they start fighting, my own childhood stuff gets triggered and I just lose my temper. This is where the P4 plan comes in, which is Gallwitzer's implementation intention. You create a simple but powerful if-then plan based on your obstacle. If my kids start fighting and I feel my temper rising, then I will pause, take a deep breath, and zoom out by reminding myself they are just kids. By doing this exercise ahead of time, you're forging a strong mental link between the trigger situation, the if, and your desired action, the then. It takes the effort and decision-making out of the equation for when you're actually in the stressful moment. Your brain already knows the plan. Cross shows how this can work for everyday annoyances and even for profound challenges, like grieving a sudden loss. Studies show WOOP is incredibly effective and has long-lasting benefits for everything from grades and health habits to relationships. It's the practical, actionable strategy that turns all the knowledge from the previous chapters into a real, usable skill. It's how you go from being a student of your emotions to being the pilot. Conclusion: it's 5 a.m. Do you know where your emotions are? So, the book wraps up beautifully by bringing everything together in a really personal and powerful way. Cross starts with a story that would terrify any parent. He wakes up at 5 a.m. to a text that his daughter's school is cancelled due to an anonymous shooting threat. It's a real-life, high-stakes emotional crisis. But instead of just telling us what to do, he shows us. He walks us through how he used the very shifters he's been talking about all along. He feels the initial fear, his heart pounds, scary images flash in his mind, he doesn't deny it. But he doesn't let it consume him. He uses perspective shifters, zooming out to remind himself that no one is hurt and there's nothing he can do right now. He uses attention shifters, deliberately distracting himself by working on the book and resisting the urge to dive into the co-ruminating parent group chats. He uses relationship shifters by talking to a friend with a broader perspective and caring for his wife and daughter, which helps regulate their emotions too. It's a masterclass in seeing the tools in action. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to manage it so it doesn't paralyze you. He then circles back to his grandmother, Dora, one last time. He realizes that she had her own, unique toolbox for shifting. She didn't use the same tools he does, but she used what worked for her: high doses of family and community support, relationships, Jewish cultural traditions like prayer, culture, and even her houseplants, a sensory and space shifter. This is the final, crucial point of the book. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions. We all need to experiment and find the unique combination of shifters that works for us. The book ends with a call to action. He asks the question that people always ask him after his talks: why wasn't I taught this? He points out that we spend years in school learning about the digestive system, but get almost no formal education on our emotional system, which is arguably far more critical to our daily lives and success. He urges us not only to use this knowledge for ourselves but to share it with our kids, in our workplaces, in our communities, to normalize the conversation about emotions and empower everyone with these essential life skills. It's an incredibly hopeful and inspiring end to a book that feels less like a self-help manual and more like a liberating guide to being human.